Welcome, everybody, to the Rideshare Rodeo podcast. My guest today is the one and only Karen Anderson. For those who do not know Karen, you will hear very shortly. But with last week's ruling by the U.S. Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals, I felt like it was a good time to bring up Prop 22, AB5, and kind of any chance I get, so it doesn't sound like a broken record. It's not addressed every podcast that I do, but there was a time we were talking about it a lot more often. So any chance that I get where the news is right or it's that moment, I always want to make sure that we're tagging that moment in time with talking about it, because a lot of people are even new to all this game and they come in and they're like, what does all this mean? I see it all the time. So instead of sending them back to older videos, it's always good to have an expert on. Karen is an expert. I feel like she's a bigger expert than most of the people, most of her elected officials, to be honest. She lives in the is it the great state or the crazy state of California? I'm not sure.
The former Golden State, now tarnished by horrible labor laws.
Yeah. So welcome, Karen. Thank you for joining me.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah. I see Kim Cavan out there. Hi, Kim. Always love you stopping by. Hey, Traveler. Hey, Wendy. Hey, everybody watching. Hope you're all doing well. Kick back if you are very confused by this. Don't worry. It'll all be solved here soon. You'll still be a little confused, but I think you'll have a much better understanding. That's why I think when we do these, they're really good. So if you are catching this live today, please comment if you're on YouTube, Facebook, or Twitter. We should see the comments come through or questions and do our best to address them. So where to start? So Uber lost its long-running attempt to overturn California gig law that would require it to provide employment rights to its drivers and delivery workers. So clearly we're talking about Prop 22. And there's a couple of different outcomes. Karen and I were talking about before we went live, how it's not black and white at all. In fact, it's just shades of gray. It can get so confusing. The timeline alone, what's happened, but can you shed some light on and remember, Karen, that some people have never, maybe they started at working gig apps 8 months ago and they've been getting Prop 22, but they don't even know why they're getting it. I get those comments sometimes. They're not even sure what it is. They're like, I think it's just a stipend. So there are people who really just don't even know why they get it. So do you want to bring us up to speed? And
well, first of all, the two cases that you're referring to they're two separate cases involving rideshare and app-based delivery that have nothing to, I mean, they kind of, they intersect in a way, but they have nothing to do with, one of them has absolutely nothing to do with Prop 22. So let's talk about Prop 22. Prop 22 is a ballot initiative in California that was brought forth by the rideshare and app-based delivery sector. And it, AB5, which is the anti-independent contractor law in California, went into effect in January of 2020, and it made everybody presume to be an employee unless you can prove otherwise. So it was really directed at the gig economy and rideshare and all the rest. Well, in November, on November 3rd of 2020, we had the statewide election and the national election, and Prop 22 passed by almost 60% of the vote to allow rideshare drivers and app-based delivery drivers to remain independent contractors. And that is the crux of Prop 22. Now, they added all of these other little perks, purported perks and stipends into the mix to make it, maybe more of its own little labor law, in addition to being a carve out from AB5. But in essence, Prop 22 allows drivers to remain independent contractors. Well, of course, unions were not going to settle for that, so they took it to court. And in, I think it was August of 2021, a judge in Alameda County, Judge Frank Rush, declared that it was unconstitutional. So the state of California actually appealed that ruling, and not actually, it was rideshare and delivery appealed that ruling, and then it was basically in March of 2020.
Wait, was that based on the fact that the constitutional challenge, is that because it had taken away it hadn't even taken it away, it had made an agreement about you were like giving up your right to organize? Is that pretty much the constitutional part, or no?
No, it had to do with workers' comp. Like, who
Okay.
does Prop 22 infringe upon the state legislature's power to create workers' comp law? And that's kind of
Okay.
what basically it boiled down to. And do the voters have plenary power with that decision making? And among other things that they argued. But basically, it was upheld. The Court of Appeal upheld it as basically constitutional, and that happened back in March of last year. And then, of course, SEIU, the unions, they weren't going to settle for that, so they appealed it again, and I think it was on May 21st of this year they heard oral arguments, and it looks to me like the California Supreme Court, where they took it to, is likely to uphold it as constitutional. You could kind of read the tea leaves and listen, all of the legal analysis and the news reports afterwards. Anybody that watched it, actually, you could tell that the justices were skeptical about the arguments about it not being constitutional. It'll probably be upheld, but we'll find out in August, somewhere like 90 days after this decision that happened, in 90 days after the oral arguments.
Okay. So is this a good point to talk about the Olson part?
Yes.
Because that might be a really big piece that people probably aren't even aware of, unless you're really into this and really are following it.
Yeah, Olson versus State of California was under the radar for a long time. They filed that Lydia Olson was the plaintiff. She's a driver for Uber, and it was filed, by Uber and Postmates in 2019, right after AB5 was signed into law by Governor Newsom.
So between October, November, whenever it was put into law of 2019 and the end of the year.
Yeah. AB5 was signed into law, I think, on September 17th, 2019. And then right after that, Uber and Postmates and Lydia Olson, the plaintiff, filed a lawsuit stating that, AB5 violates the Equal Protection Clause and is unfairly targeting rideshare and all the rest. So they wanted a preliminary injunction to put a stop on the enforcement of AB5 on rideshare while they fight it out. So in February, AB5 went into effect in January of 2020, and then in February of 2020, a month later, district court judge, her name was Dolly Gee, just dismissed their case outright. She didn't even want to hear it, So Olson versus the State of California just kind of, was just under the radar for a really long time. And then in, I think it was July of 2022, we heard oral arguments in front of the three-judge panel of the Ninth Circuit, and it was unbelievable. Kim, who's joined us, she watched it along with me and other nerds, and we just couldn't believe it. I mean, the state could not defend AB5 in front of these three judges. They just, and so then this time last year, actually March, I think it was March 17th last year, this three-judge panel issued a ruling saying, yeah, it's plausible that AB5 violates the Equal Protection Clause under the 13th Amendment as it applies to rideshare and delivery, and that and that it's a law without without rationale. I mean, there's no rational explanation for all of the exemptions that pick winners and losers and all of that, and also that rideshare delivery were targeted with animus by the author of the bill, Lorena Gonzalez, and she was cited in that decision like 14 times for all her bad behavior. And it was, they called it corrupt, they called it naked favoritism and pure spite. And they said, these three judges of the Ninth Circuit said that the state of California could not, cough up a regional rationale to explain all of these arbitrary exemptions. So it was very much a victory for us. I mean, it was very validating. It was like everything we've always said all along. AB5 just is, it's just an unfair law and targets some people and doesn't the other. And of course, it excoriated Lorena Gonzalez.
Right.
And so the state of California was not going to rest easy with that. And unions were not going to rest easy with that decision. So they decided that they were going to request an en-banc review of the Ninth Circuit, meaning they wanted more judges to get involved and potentially overturn this really bad ruling from the Ninth Circuit, the three judges, and they got their wish.
I don't live in your state, but it does seem like the Ninth Circuit puts out a lot of your crazy decisions. I don't know.
Well,
I always see Ninth Circuit when I see a bad article.
Last week, these 11 judges revealed their ruling.
Yeah, I know. This is what
basically they vacated that old one that was favorable to our side, and said, I mean, you wouldn't believe what they said.
The judge said there are plausible reasons for treating Uber differently from other types of companies.
Absolutely. They said,
and part of it says, and this confuses me a lot, said that for treating Uber differently from other types of companies that use gig workers, even like WAG. If you guys are familiar with Rover's more of a you land your clients. WAG is an on-demand dog walking service. It's no different than a rideshare or a delivery.
Right. And so what Uber was arguing in that case is that, there's all these exemptions in AB5 for various professions get exempted from the ABC test of AB5. Right. And of course, none of it makes sense. For example, a psychologist can get an exemption, but a pharmacist cannot. A grant writer can get an exemption, but a grant researcher cannot. A doctor can get an exemption, but a nurse practitioner cannot. And the list goes on and on and on and on and on. Mm-hmm. In the case of rideshare,
608, right? 608 careers destroyed.
Well,
I'm just going off. Karen has a list.
We've identified 600 categories of professions that have been affected by AB5 in some way, shape, or form at some time or other. So, yeah, it affects every single business in California. It affects you in some way or another, whether you realize it or not.
Oh yeah, yeah, degrees of separation.
Right. So where was I at with that?
I did want to know
Uber and Lyft. There's different categories of exemptions in AB5, and one of the categories is the referral agency category of exemptions, and there's like 16 professions named or sectors named in that exemption, but you have to pass like 11 requirements in order to be able to take advantage of that exemption. So one of a referral agency would be like Handy or TaskRabbit or WAG. Yeah. So it basically Uber and Lyft.
But wait a minute. WAG is not a referral company. WAG is an on-demand real-time offer. It's a gig platform. It's straight up the same as I'm even looking here, and there's a quote from that 11 judge thing that says perceived transportation and delivery companies as the most significant perpetrators of the problem it sought to address. So it's like they know WAG is doing the same thing too, but they're like, yeah, that's not our. Right. It's almost like I have a dog and I'm on the judge panel, so I don't want WAG in there.
Well, dog walking is listed as one of the professions under the referral agency category of exemptions. And,
Mhm.
like you're saying, well, make it make sense. I can't make it make sense. Nobody can make it make sense. But professions like, trades or whatever under TaskRabbit, for example, have exemptions under the referral agency category of exemptions, like yard work and picture hanging and moving and those kinds of things. So that kind of, gives TaskRabbit, an avenue for exempting those kinds of workers from within their platform so that they can be independent contractors if they meet all 12 of these requirements. So it's just a complete and total mess. It doesn't, it's filled with landmines. It is arbitrary. It does pick winners and losers, and it does target Uber and Lyft with animus. It most
Yeah.
certainly does.
I mean,
But
it almost, and I would even include DoorDash and such too. I mean, I would,
exactly.
and I'm never defending these companies, but I'm saying, like, just being honest here, like, it seemed like, I know WAG, and there's another platform for dog walking called Rover.
Rover, yeah.
And Rover's more of a, like, I come pitch you, I set my own price, all that kind of thing, which would make me a true independent contractor, which would make me fall under AB5 and not be able to do it. But WAG makes no sense, because WAG is literally, you're just saying, I need a dog walked right now, and you're going to get the person who accepts it. It's not going to be your regular person.
Right. And do you use a car to go over and pick the dog up and transport the dog down to the harbor to the park in your car? You're
Probably.
doing rideshare with the dog in the back seat.
Yeah.
A moving company, for example, has an exemption. So you're moving furniture. Aren't you using a car to do that and deliver? Errands, people who run errands have an exemption under that category of exemptions. And yet, what are you going to do? You're going to walk to the grocery store for the senior and get them their milk and their oatmeal?
So
No.
is that, I mean, I'm just taking a stab at something here. Is that because of LA and all the actors who need their assistance?
I don't know.
I'm just asking
There's
because,
no definition of what an errand person is under the referral cat. This is why it's such a mess. So, Uber, the Olson people, the plaintiffs in the Olson case had very much rational reason, in their complaint for saying, none of this makes sense. It picks winners and losers. It's unfairly targeting us when similarly situated platforms are getting exemptions and we're not. So that was the basis of their 13th, their equal protection clause argument. And they also said that Lorena Gonzalez herself targeted them with animus, and it was irrational and it was blatant.
by the way, if you're blocked on Lorena Gonzalez on Twitter, it's okay. So are we. And then you're one of us, and it's all good.
So this time back in March, those 3 judges, the first Ninth Circuit that heard the Olson case, agreed with the plaintiffs. They agreed with everything that were. It's like, none of this makes sense. Yes, she targeted them. Yes, she did backroom dealing and she's corrupt. And yes, this violates the Equal Protection Clause.
Right.
So that would set a precedent for all of us, all the other professions that are unduly harmed by this law, to be able to argue that 13th, that Equal Protection Clause argument. Now, the 11 judges, all of them Democrats, I might add, and they waited and waited so that the court could be loaded with judges, that would be more favorable. These people, you should see what they wrote.
I mean, did they explain
They called Uber and they called rideshare and delivery evil. They used that word.
Like, can you put it into its context?
The California legislature acted rationally by striking at an evil where it is felt and reaching the class of cases where it most frequently occurs. And then they said that they are the biggest contributor to the problem. And they said this is what gets me. It is not necessary that such a perception be supported by evidence or empirical data, and that the law is rational. That's what these 11 judges unanimously said. So, I mean, if you're following any of this at all, you would be just outraged by that conclusion, because it's just, we have plenty of empirical evidence
I
about
mean, there were
how
clearly
irrational the law is.
in this courtroom, there's very smart people too. I mean, not one of the 11 judges, obviously, but there's people watching this who are like expecting make sense of this case. So what is the best wording that these 11 judges even came up? I mean, I just can't understand how they're like, yep, this is obviously clearly not a problem, and or it's not a violation of I mean, I'm just
What's the best word for
what's
their
the best public
It's outrageous.
wording of this?
Bias. It's inherent bias. It's people just going along with this narrative that unions have about independent contractors, and all of us supposedly being misclassified and overstating. I mean, AB5 in itself is really not needed. We have laws in the books here that are more fair for rooting out actual real misclassification.
Yeah. I think that you and I have discussed that on prior ones. So for those maybe catching the first time that Karen and I are talking about this stuff, I think you've even told me how other states, like even my state, has AB5 or ABC language in it. Yes. But it's just kind of, we don't like, why dig to it? You guys were the first ones to dig to it and like, let's use this.
Well, the ABC test in California is the strictest classification test in the nation, and that's why so many people are affected.
Right. Nobody in any gig would, because I mean, if it gets thrown out, they'd be under AB5, and not one gig worker will be able to be not considered an employee. Am I correct?
Right. So how this case relates to Prop 22, technically it doesn't, because it's not about Prop 22, even though Prop 22 is a carve out for rideshare. But the problem now is that, AB5 went into effect in January of 2020, and Prop 22 went into effect in November of 2020. So there's this window of time between January and November where AB5 now applies to rideshare and delivery because of this ruling. So any of these pending lawsuits and all the rest, Uber and Lyft and DoorDash, they're all on the hook for all of that. So it could cost this, just for that short period of time between January and November, all of those months, could cost them millions and millions and millions of dollars.
Yeah.
Because Prop 22 is not retroactive.
Right. But this is where I would have made sure to get something in writing if I was these companies, whatever it was, January 31st, because January 31st, 2020, for those who don't know this and those that can't go back in that timeline, we're still 2 months back of the pandemic. We do not know what's happening, whatever. But
January 2020. Yeah.
Yeah. So AB5's in effect, and it's like the 31st of the month or whatever. And Uber and Lyft have till like midnight, literally. It's like a midnight thing. And it's
in
like
October.
Yeah. And so they're like, we have till midnight and they literally were like, we'll just close shop. They did get to the point. They said, we'll leave.
That's right. Because there was this shock and awe campaign from city attorneys and the attorney general and all the rest, after going after all these Instacart, DoorDash, Uber, Lyft, all of them. They were coming from all directions during that period, that window of time before Prop 22 was passed.
Right.
And so in a way, it kind of backfired on them, because people were like, whoa, we're in the middle of a pandemic. I need my groceries delivered to my house. I need a way to make some money on the side to survive. I want to continue driving, and you ask most of the drivers, they wanted to remain independent contractors. They did not want to be
in every market. That's the case.
Right. So that's what Prop 22 is about. It's people, yes, it's a carve out from AB5, but it also has these little things like health stipends and, a minimum wage guarantee.
Yeah, 120. But see, that's on active time too. That's not just by turning on the apps.
Right. And in a way, they should have just left all of that out.
Yeah.
But I think they behind the scenes wanted to appease all sorts of people, because the people that wrote Prop 22 were all Democrats.
I guess I'm thinking back to the Vina Dubal interview and some others that I had with other groups in California. We're pushing for different directions of all this. And they were saying how part of the reason why the state allowed Uber and Lyft to stay, especially because they said that they couldn't have transportation disrupted and that there wasn't enough transportation to handle everything. That was one of the reasons California cited. So my question becomes, at that point, didn't the state just, how can you go back and sue them? I understand, but how can you go back in this and say, hey, listen,
that's why it's so schizophrenic, because Prop 22 has been challenged as unconstitutional, but it's the state of California, the same attorney general that released a statement. Here, I'll read you a statement about Olson. It was unbelievable. Today, this is from, that's Lorena Gonzalez. Rob Bonta, the attorney general of the state of California. The Ninth Circuit unanimously rejected Uber and Postmates' attempt to invalidate AB5's protections for app-based drivers. AB5 was enacted to ensure businesses couldn't misclassify workers to avoid paying benefits and providing legal protections. This is a win for California workers. That's what he said. But you know who's arguing in favor of Prop 22? Rob Bonta. Because he, as the attorney general, he is obliged to uphold the will of the voters. So,
and that was another thing I was going to say too. And I know I've said this to you before, and I think the answer we came up with was like, who knows? But I now get brought back to the fact of like, why after you let however many, I mean, I know it won 58% of the vote yes on 22, which was like 3 million plus votes. But so if you can imagine the amount of people voting in California, how do you go back and say, whoops, what you voted on doesn't matter, and we're gonna
California didn't say that.
No, but if they were to change Prop 22, it's like, well, why didn't your lawyers catch that?
Because
before it was ever voted on.
There's nothing unconstitutional about it.
Right. But I'm saying, like, why is that even a thing?
22 regardless. And they're going to come up with whatever harebrained schemes they want to say that it's unconstitutional. And an activist judge in Alameda County went along with it and declared Prop 22 unconstitutional. Well, in the Court of Appeals in March of last year, it was basically upheld and said, yes, it's constitutional. And then unions still, they don't want to settle for that. So they appealed that again. And on May 21st, just, a couple months ago, last month, they heard oral arguments, the California Supreme Court, about Prop 22. And Rob Bonta and his deputy attorney generals were arguing in favor of upholding Prop 22. And by all accounts, anybody who watched that and all of the legal analysis and the news stories after that hearing said, oh, it looks like the California Supreme Court is skeptical of any of these arguments, and they're going to uphold it as constitutional. They basically just steamrolled right over that, supposedly it's an unconstitutional argument. So we'll find out in August.
Right. So, okay. But if Prop 22 is upheld, it's a victory to Uber, obviously.
Well, it's a victory to people who want to remain independent contractors.
Right, but it doesn't help like the AB5 attacked. You're just talking just the gig app people, right? Yeah.
Yeah, well, that's what people get confused about. A lot of people.
Yeah. I'm just making it clear
that same thing.
Because I mean, like, guys, part of Karen's expertise is because AB5 destroyed what she does.
Right. AB5 applies to every single worker in the state of California. It presumes that you're an employee unless you can prove otherwise, unless the hiring entity can prove otherwise. Right. So it impacts, hundreds of thousands, millions of people.
Yeah.
Workers, So AB5.
Right. There's 1.4 million gig workers in California, and I'm guessing about easily 1.4 people like you, million, were affected by AB5. Easy.
Well, you say gig workers, but there's also career professionals.
App-based gig workers. Sorry.
Yeah. Yeah. So people think that AB5 only applies to the app world or the Uber and Lyft or trucking or whatever. It applies to everybody. It applies to doctors, lawyers, real estate appraisers, music performers.
I mean, I always go back to it. You know, if you want to get how dirty and downright it is, they ended a nonprofit opera house.
Well, they're ending a lot of nonprofit opera houses.
I mean, I know, but like,
and theaters.
My point is, like, the state has being a nonprofit is not an easy thing to be. Gail did that correctly. She went through the correct hoops. She did everything many years ago, had been doing this for a long time, knew what she was doing, had created her own nonprofit business. And the states keep up on that very big. If you're a nonprofit, do you have are you meeting all the criteria? I think we can all agree on that, but all of a sudden they're like, yeah, you're affected by this too.
Right. And you see every day we see evidence of theaters closing because they can't operate. AB5 just increased their costs by so much. You have to make every single person, and you have to put every single person on payroll, regardless of how long they work. They could work for you for a day, an hour, a second. You still have to put them on payroll. You know, and so in the theatrical community, that's that's really a hardship. And all the grants that they promised for these arts groups, Newsom is now cutting the arts grants back by almost 60%. So all the promises that the state made to help the theatrical community comply with AB5 is being reneged. And then we recently heard, I don't know if you read about it or not, but these loan out payroll companies that have independent contractors in the film industry, all of a sudden EDD, the Employment Development Department, is saying, well, you know, they haven't been enforcing AB5 on these people evidently all along, but you cannot be an independent contractor in the film industry, whether you're a loan out or have an LLC or an S corp or not. So everybody's like, where is this coming from? And I'm like, well, we've known about this since 2020. You don't.
Yeah, I mean, so I have a friend who's in Sacramento. He was in LA. He owns Hayho Studios, Tremaine Hayho. He's the founder. He's the CEO. He puts out movies. He's made some, you know, fair budget size movies too. He's done some good stuff. I keep telling him about this, and he's like, hey man, it hasn't affected me yet. But my concern is that one day they come knocking on his door, and it's not just for a single instance.
No.
That it's going to be like, you made this movie, you had this worker, you had these 10 actors, and they're going to give them a fine on all the instances.
You're exactly right. And it's all fun and games until you get audited. And so, but the problem is that the Employment Development Department and the Labor Commissioner, their enforcement is arbitrary or non-existent on certain sectors. And so everybody's got this false sense of security that AB5 doesn't apply to them, or that they can just continue to do business as usual with independent contractors. You see that, you know, in all sorts of sectors. Court reporters seem to think that AB5 doesn't apply to them. Well, it does.
Well, he's lived in California his whole life. Pretty smart guy. And he's also pretty political. Like, it's astounding to me that he doesn't, like, he's asked me about it. He's like, what it is again? And I'm like, bro, you live there, man.
Well,
how do you not know?
That's the problem with AB5. It's so,
I mean, still to this day though, and I've told him about it. He's like, yeah, I mean, I guess it doesn't. He's thinking, I guess it doesn't apply to me. I know what you're saying, but they're not doing anything to me. But my fear is that it's not going to, even a $20,000 fine is way too much. But my fear is that that's a life ender if they come knock on his door for what he's done in the last 4 years. Because
there's civil penalties tacked on top of that could be up to $25,000 per violation. So that if you've got a crew of 20 to 30 people, or you're a theater and you have 40 people that you have made independent contractors, and you get audited and you were found to be misclassifying every single one of them under AB5 or even the Borello standard, you're going to probably go bankrupt with fines. But the problem is that they there's not, you can come into my group and you can read the horror stories, the audit horror stories from people who just were blindsided by these audits, and they're just the little guys, an architect, a florist, event planners, wedding photographers, all these people getting audited for the crime of having a single independent contractor. And what happens is that what triggered the audit was that the independent contractor most likely applied for unemployment insurance benefits during the pandemic and named their client as an employer. And so that triggers an automatic audit, and it gives the EDD jurisdiction to investigate, see if they've, if they've violated, if they've misclassified their worker.
Right. But then I'd question, like how you said, the film industry they're affected, but they're not touched yet. It's like, how did none of you get audited? Because we all know audits are supposed to be spread evenly. And
the unions are behind protecting their own. I mean, it was just, I was just incredulous that everybody was like clutching their pearls going, oh, they've come up with a new something or other at EDD that we're not allowed to be independent contractors. I'm like, well, have you got people been living under a rock for the last 4 years?
Mm-hmm.
And then they're going to back away from it, especially during election year, because they don't want to roust, they don't want to poke the bear.
And also in the show notes, you can find this, but if you go to Facebook and just type that in, you'll find Karen's group, which I believe is public too, correct? I mean,
it's public. You can come in, but I mean, we get the rude awakening for me from the very beginning of all of this, when I first started the group back in 2019, were the audit stories on small businesses and single person businesses getting audited.
Mm-hmm.
The
horse. I'll put those in there too, because I have those blog roll links. So I already have the link to our Facebook group. But if you guys just want to read some of these too, I have the horror stories and the professions that were affected. Karen's made like complete lists, and some of the stories are just horrible, or they all are, but some are actually like what they said about what what they said about Uber. They're evil. Some of those stories are straight up evil.
The evil is coming from the enforcement.
That's what I mean. I mean, like, to hear a story like that and know that nobody had their back or like even heard them out or anything is just ridiculous.
But back to Prop 22, people and reporters and media and politicians and even legislators, people who should know better, get Prop 22 mixed up with AB5. They think that Prop 22 is the same thing as AB5. Prop 22 is a single carve out for a single industry from AB5.
Yeah, I either people kind of know, and know correctly, or people think that AB5 happened and Prop 22 corrected it.
Right. Prop 22 didn't do anything. It didn't repeal AB5. It didn't overturn the law. You read that over and over again. Prop 22 overturned AB5.
But I'm sure California loves that buzz too. Like, oh yeah, we had AB5, mistake. Prop 22 corrected it. Because then they just figure people will just overlook it and go about their day.
Right. And the pandemic was the biggest gift that Lorena Gonzalez, the vile author of the law, her putrid law, as much of a dumpster fire as it was the first 3 months before the pandemic, put everybody out of business and locked the state down. If not for the pandemic, the absurdities and the actual real dumpster fire would have been exposed to the general public, in much more graphic terms. But as it turned out, musicians, they couldn't go in the workplace anyways because of the pandemic. Theaters are closed because of the pandemic, but theaters were closing the first 3 months of AB5 before the pandemic even hit because of AB5. Festivals were shutting down because of AB5. Bands were unable to perform before the pandemic because of AB5. And the interpreters and translators were not able to operate as independent contractors before everything got shut down, and they're not in a public space, so that the pandemic really obscured all of it. and Lorena Gonzalez could blame the pandemic on everything.
And that's another thing that people do say to me is they say, I have comments on videos sometimes that say things like, Prop 22 was put in place because of the pandemic. No, it wasn't. Prop 22 was put into place and already was being thought of by the Flex Association, all these gig apps, when they got together with their 208 million months before the pandemic. Had nothing to do with it.
Right. And then you have the interesting thing about Prop 22 is the people that were working on Prop 22 behind the scenes were Black African-American Democrat elite. Tony West is the chief legal officer for Uber. He's Kamala Harris's brother-in-law. Valerie Jarrett was the senior advisor for the Obama White House for 8 years. She was the director, the board of directors of Lyft. LaFonza Butler, who got appointed to the U.S. Senate seat when Dianne Feinstein died, by Gavin Newsom. She actually left. She left SEIU as a union organizer and got hired by Uber to work on Prop 22 behind the scenes. And then you had Anthony Fox, who was the transportation secretary under Obama, who was with the chief policy officer for Lyft. So all of these people, all these Democrat elite were working on Prop 22 behind the scenes. So they were the ones that were probably pushing all of these little, these subsidies and stipends and protections and all the rest, when in reality, it would have been just much simpler to just set all of that aside, because it's going to backfire and people are going to be disappointed. They're going to conflate that with what the real benefit of Prop 22 is that it allows you to remain an independent contractor. So these healthcare stipends and all that, I equate that to cheap stocking stuffers. But the real present under the tree is that you can remain an independent contractor as a driver, because Uber and Lyft are not going to, they can't, their business model can't operate as a W-2.
Well, I think the proof there is that, like, I know a lot of rideshare drivers in California who do private rides, as you should. Being a ride, like, absolutely, man. You're an independent contractor. They want to pay you like an IC, but treat you like a W-2 at the gig apps. Well, you should be having private clients if you can. Absolutely. Take advantage of it. So, but there's people in California doing that. So when they're on the apps, they're protected. When they're not, they're breaking the law.
Right. And, Uber is it's really a shame for the rest of our freelancer movement that Uber is the face of the misclassification pursuit, because they make a convenient villain,
And I think that it's all the other states look at Prop 22 and again, AB5. I think they look at that as one thing, and it's all this Uber related mess.
Right. And they forget about all the dolphins in the tuna net, that are caught up in it by design, I might add, all of us. And so, Uber and Lyft, no matter what you think about their business model, or if you despise, I can understand why people despise the fact that they were able to carve out their own labor law that actually exempts them not only from the ABC test of AB5, but the traditional Borello standard that everybody else is subjected to. Yeah. If you pass the ABC test, or if you have an exemption from the ABC test, you're still in California. You still have to pass an 11-factor test called Borello in order to be an independent contractor. So there's all these restrictions all over everything, but Uber and Lyft obscures all of the collateral damage.
Yeah. I mean, I think actually, even all the times that we do these streams and whatnot, I feel like at least some people, and even if it's just a handful that awaken, need to know that if nothing else that you take away, you need to understand AB5 is nothing to do with Prop 22. I mean, Prop 22 has to do with AB5.
Right.
But AB5 does not have anything to do with Prop 22. AB5 was put into existence before they ever murmured the words Prop 22.
Prop 22 was in response to AB5. It was a carve out. You could get carve outs all sorts of different ways. Different industries had different, ways of getting their own carve outs from the law. But
right. I mean, we've joked. We've joked, and we've also been honest. I mean, like lawyers, obviously they're carved out without even talking to anybody. we're not going to deal with that.
They're carved out, but you see AB5, even for people that have professions that have carve outs, AB5 is a wrecking ball into their traditional work relationships. In other words, they can't, because paralegals don't have a carve out.
Right.
A lawyer can't bring on a paralegal as an independent contractor on a case where that independent contractor is working directly on for a client. So
they could probably hire him as a plumber and let them
right.
Because it just, guys, it just has to be outside of the scope of the business is the B prong.
Like a grant writer has an exemption, but a grant researcher does not. So is a little grant writer, like an individual grant writer, going to actually put a grant researcher on their payroll and hire them as an employee? That's where it all comes. So back to Olson, because this court, this Ninth Circuit says that, AB5 is a rational law and there's no equal protection issue at all with it. So when you look at a profession like transcribers who don't have an exemption, that particular freelance profession is completely extinct in California. But yet proofreaders have an exemption, copywriters have partial exemptions. Every exemption comes with fine print. But why do translators have an exemption, but a transcriber does not? And so that is a violation of the Equal Protection Clause. Now, this case really,
and with each exemption, they never put a justification with it. Like, we exempted this for this reason.
They can't, and that's what
right. I know that's why, but I mean, they didn't even try, right?
No. Why?
I mean, you just would see it. It was almost like watching to see if your flight's delayed. Like, you just don't know. It's just a spinning wheel, and like, okay, maybe.
Exactly, and that's what the 3 judges of the Ninth Circuit, that panel, with the original Olson decision, determined that you can't make rhyme or reason. In fact, they even used that word. We can't make rhyme or reason of any of these exemptions. They're all arbitrary, capricious. They pick winners and losers, and it's just a complete and total mess.
So I brought this comment up because I wanted to see, I mean, I know, Joe, but I wanted to see what you thought. So ICs who know and understand in California are afraid. He has several friends who have chosen to move into W-2 realm for fear their current careers were in violation. So I guess my bigger question to his comment is, if let's say they just did it yesterday, wouldn't they still be potentially at risk for all the years that they were doing it?
No, because AB5 doesn't apply to the worker himself. It's the hiring entity.
I'm saying if in any way you were involved in your own business or whatever you were doing, freelancing, and now you're like, I'm going to get out of this, that doesn't put you in the clear.
No, like a journalist. I mean, just because you're a staff writer on payroll with a newspaper doesn't mean you're not going to get laid off. There's tons of layoffs happening, So the people that are left standing are the longtime freelancers like myself. But in Joe's comment, your career is only at risk because the hiring entity is not going to hire you as an independent contractor. These enforcement agencies don't go after the independent contractor. They go after the hiring entity that might misclassify you or may not have misclassified you. So if the hiring entity is misclassifying you, but they are operating, as business as usual and they never get caught, then it's business as usual for the independent contractor. But the onus is on the hiring entity to prove that their contracting relationship with their independent contractors satisfies all 3 criteria of the ABC test or the exemptions criteria from the ABC test and the Borello test.
So Kim is saying here, Uber is a convenient villain in an era when people fear technology, but this kind of freelance busting affects us all.
She's absolutely right. She summed it up perfectly. And freelance busting is a phrase that Kim came up with, and it perfectly describes what unions and these policymakers are doing to legitimate independent contractors, self-employed people, solopreneurs, all of us who are caught up in this law that we don't want to be in. We don't want to be made employees. We run
Yeah.
our own business. We are our own boss, and we do it for a reason. And also, people that just want a little side gig to supplement their W-2 job. Maybe they want to work on the weekends, driving for Lyft for 5 hours a week or whatever, just to pay for their kids' little league. It affects all independent contractors, whether you're doing it for a living as a career or you're doing it just as a side hustle.
Yeah.
In the United States, that would be about 70 million people who participate in self-employment opportunities.
Yeah. I couldn't agree more. So now what the people do need to hear, and I think I'd already said it though, that if Prop 22 is thrown out, that means that the companies now have to fall back as you are a W-2. I don't even think they'll play ball with that, even in California where they really want to be. I know they've explored franchise model, things like this, but I honestly believe when they threatened to leave the state of California, they meant it. And I believe that if they were to do this and throw Prop 22 out, but I also see a downside of that too, because if they, well, I guess they have to uphold it, but I'm just trying to find the angle here that helps AB5. Like, is there any part of this that's still left going on with the Prop 22 stuff that would help AB5?
Oh yeah. I mean, if Prop 22 were overturned, which is likely not going to be, the state of California is advocating for to be upheld for one thing.
Yeah.
And the Supreme Court justices were very skeptical of that. So it's likely it will be upheld. But if it weren't upheld for whatever reason, it would be the floodgates would open, and you would find.
It wouldn't fix AB5, but it would put it back in front of your face again real fast.
Yeah, it would be back in the headlines for rideshare, and people would get it confused, and they would think, oh, AB5 is back. People think that AB5 is just about Uber and Lyft.
Yeah, no.
Most people don't realize that it's about all these every profession under the sun in California. But Prop 22, if it were to overturn, you would have a floodgate that would metastasize across the country for eliminating Uber and Lyft altogether.
Yeah, I know, but I'm just saying, like, you're saying the 90 days that they have at the Supreme Court is for, that's going to be August. We have an election in November. It would like rehatch all of the explosion in California again about AB5. So as much as I know it would suck for all the people I know doing rideshare, it almost would force some solving of this, because guys, all the problems get solved if AB5 gets destroyed.
Well, let me tell you, Governor Newsom, he's buddies with all the people that wrote Prop 22. And he never came out for or against Prop 22, which his silence was basically told us that he was for it. He wanted some kind of compromise or some kind of hybrid something or other, So for him, it would be his worst nightmare if he saw, rideshare and delivery just leave the state in droves, not be able to operate. And then all of these lawsuits, it would just put the companies out of business in California.
Right.
But Prop 22 is it's validating, for example, a lot of people in my group back in 2020, they were conflicted about voting for Prop 22. They didn't think it was fair that rideshare and delivery could pay for a carve out via a ballot initiative. And what about us? And how come it doesn't apply to all of us? And we don't like Uber anyway, so we think.
Yeah, I was gonna say, like, what is it that sold the voters? Because I remember my friends who lived in California even asking me, because they knew I was talking about, like, wait, which way do I vote on this? Because it seems like if I vote yes on Prop 22, I'm voting with these bad companies like Uber and this stuff. And they're like, and especially your state, I would think most people don't want to vote with Uber.
No, during the pandemic, you have to remember what the climate was, and the state made a really bad strategic calculation by doing this shock and awe litigation lawsuits thrown at them that were going to push them out of the state. And people were like, no, 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 we don't want to lose our rideshare and delivery, especially during the
Exactly.
pandemic. And also 80% of the drivers wanted to remain independent contractors. So the Yes on Prop 22 campaign never focused on AB5 as a whole. They never talked about other professions as to how AB5 affects other professions. They only were concerned about themselves. So they ran all of these TV ads and radio ads all day long with, sunny very sunny, positive. We want to remain independent contractors. And in essence, that is what the voters voted for. They voted for them to remain independent contractors because the drivers themselves wanted to remain independent contractors.
So I have this, I do have this last question then that I got to ask, because I don't think I've ever asked you this before. So if there had never been a pandemic, but everything else played out the same, because all that was so close. The CARES Act was late March 2020, AB5 was January. But when AB5 hit and Prop 22 became a ballot initiative, would it have changed even by 1% the vote on
If there was not
Prop
a pandemic?
22 if there was no pandemic?
No, probably because there would have been such a backlash against AB5 as a whole. I mean, you would have just seen the amount of ridiculousness that would have been exposed, in all of its, putrid glory. If there had not been a pandemic, it would have probably propelled Prop 22 to even get more votes.
Do you think it would have helped kill AB5 off?
Yes.
Do you think that
they wouldn't have been able to
again, guys, the timing had nothing to do with the pandemic. Even AB5 was in law months before.
Yeah, there would have been such a backlash that would be so obvious. But all of these professions that were really, sectors, entire sectors, like theaters, musicians, just a regular bar band not being able to play. The musicians, they got 750,000 signatures on a change.org petition to get a seat at the table with Lorena Gonzalez to try to carve out an exemption for somebody that has a little bar band, but because of the pandemic, everybody was shut down anyway. So there's all these lockdowns in public places. So all of the fallout and the backlash that would have been exposed was obscured by the pandemic.
So it muted everything.
It muted everything and then it took the independent contractor issue kind of off the table because all sorts of people were losing their jobs, not just independent contractors. So we were no more important than anybody else that was out of work. The only thing that was painfully obvious is that now people are trying to work at home, but AB5 was preventing people from doing, signing up for online tutoring or signing up for this or doing online transcription or whatever to ride through the pandemic because AB5, we're supposed to work from home, but AB5 at that time would be preventing people from being able to be independent contractors. And that's where it was just so cruel. You had people just fleeing the state because they couldn't, they were in life-threatening situations. They lost their entire careers, and they were taking care of loved ones who were sick and all the rest as they had to flee the state.
To me, part of that is the reason part of why I asked is because it's almost like they knew the pandemic was coming. Like, this is the only time we could ever shove this down their throat.
Yeah. It was the biggest gift that Lorena Gonzalez, who is the villain in all of this and continues to be so. And she just Dr. Frankenstein and, when all the editorial cartoonists were losing their gigs because of AB5, they started lampooning her with cartoons that were being posted to my group. I have cartoonists from the LA Times, who lost their gig with the LA Times because of AB5. Columnists. Yeah. It was just starting to just really erupt into this Mount Vesuvius explosion of backlash. And then the pandemic hit and shut all that backlash down.
Yeah. But you guys, if you live in California, the threat of AB5 is still very real. If, like my friend Tremaine, if you're conducting business and you're just like, listen, I've been doing it since all that went into effect, nothing's happened, I'm pretty sure I'm okay. I would just at least check with yourself, check in with yourself, and make sure that what you're pretty safe. Or do you have a better piece of advice?
Well, if he's hiring independent contract, anybody who hires and
I'm saying
who
everybody.
pays somebody on a 1099, even if you're a single person business and you bring on board somebody as a 1099, you need to make damn sure, that you're in compliance and that you don't have a potential of misclassifying that person, because anything can happen. If you have a falling out with that person, if that person injures themselves on your work site and they're desperate and they need medical, if that person's spouse, an ex-spouse, is looking for extra income, hidden income, and contacts the EDD to find out if they're hiding money and as an independent contractor, or if your independent contractor applies for unemployment insurance benefits and mistakenly names you as their employer, you will get audited. And there are tons of examples in my group of single people, like an architect, a single person, or an event planner, or a wedding photographer who's audited by the EDD for misclassifying a second shooter that they brought to a wedding.
Same thing happened to Gail. Gail was flagged because, and she's the nonprofit that we were talking about. Gail was flagged because somebody claimed that they were unemployed because of her. No, they weren't.
Yeah, and she told me Gail has the Muni Opera, and she told us, Steve, I don't even know if you remember, she got a letter from the EDD saying she owed $25,000 or something for an independent contractor on fines for an independent contractor that she paid $610 to.
Right. So again, guys, remember, she's doing events at this opera house. So like she only does a few a year even. So she has people come through there for 3-4 days and work for her. So that's probably like 3 days of pay. You don't work for her. I mean, clearly in every definition of it, you don't work for her.
Well, musical theater production, it's clearly spelled out in AB5. You cannot have independent contractors working on your musical theater production, no matter what.
Well, then you can't have a musical theater production.
Yeah, you can. So there are musical theater productions that are flying under the radar and thinking that they can pay, stipends or have paid volunteers, which is also against the labor law in California. You can't be a paid volunteer. You're either a volunteer or you're not. So there's just all sorts of landmines everywhere you look, but it's all dependent on whether the agencies, the labor commissioner or the EDD, are going to even enforce the law that they have on the books. So if you don't enforce the law in a certain sector, like the independent film industry, to keep them quiet or whatever, to appease their unions, then then it makes it all the more harder to fight the law on behalf of everybody, because you lose tens of thousands of people who could be joining you in the fight against AB5, which is what we had in early 2020. And then a lot of people ended up getting exemptions in September of 2020. There was a cleanup bill that she came up with that added some exemptions to the existing exemptions that were already in the bill. So those musicians, the people in the band, they got an exemption. So, all of those 750,000 people that had signed that petition and were people that were a part of my group fighting the law and hosting rallies and everything else, they just peeled away.
Yeah.
And one of the most egregious examples of people peeling away were writers and editors. Just peeling away.
Well, because they were carving out the biggest groups too to shrink your notice.
Right. Translators and interpreters, I don't hear too much from them anymore. They were really a part of our movement, but they were able to get an 11th hour exemption that allows them to continue to operate. But what you have to remember about these exemptions is that there's all this fine print, and they make it really hard for you. And you might think you're exempt, but you're really not. And there's so many so many easy ways to violate that.
Almost like you're exempt till they not want you to not be.
Yeah, if they want to find that you have misclassified an independent contractor, they'll figure out a way to do it.
Right. Yeah. And
They'll just
so
use the Carlisle stuff. They'll, like the wedding photographer who had brought on the second shooter, they said that she violated the control and direction of by telling the photographer where to go and what time to show up.
which actually in my mind is kind of funny, because I know photographers, a handful of them, you do too. Like, even if I'm a photographer and I hire like Karen, who's also a photographer, to help me shoot a wedding, I'm just gonna be like, Karen, you know what to do, go. I'm actually gonna be the opposite. I'm not gonna be involved in her direction. It's gonna be like,
but if you told me what time to show up and where, according to this wedding photographer that got audited, that's what the auditor told them. Oh, that's control and direction. The dog walker that got audited, she had 4 dog walkers under her. And even though dog walkers have a specific exemption under AB5, they got audited and they owe like $100,000. And they approached the auditor and said, don't you know that we have an exemption in AB 2257, the cleanup bill? And the auditor had never heard of any exemptions for dog walkers and hadn't even heard of AB 2257. So it's just, and then Newsom himself, he brought a freelance photographer with him to his trip to China,
oh,
and by the definition of AB5, he misclassified that independent contractor photographer.
he took that same crew to, isn't his wife from Montana?
I don't know.
I think she is. And he took that whole crew up there too. And I remember that being at a time when I was like, wait a minute, you have a bunch of ICs with you.
Right.
What are you doing? You
Yeah.
know, and I don't know. It's yeah, and it was also at a time when you weren't supposed to travel to Montana from California. He was telling people they couldn't because Montana had got rid of the masks.
Right.
But then it was like the next day he was up there with independent contractors hanging out in Montana, where he told every other California you can't go.
During the pandemic, when the EDD was short-staffed, they hired some staffing agencies that were hiring independent contractors to work for the EDD in violation of their own freaking law.
Yeah, I mean, this guy, you're making me go down a rabbit hole, because this guy with the dirty laundry that we all remember, the restaurant, and
French
then
law.
I mean, but then there was also the telling everybody to, like, we're going to make California electric. We've talked about this a lot of times with vehicles. Really? Because your grid barely holds. You've even had, I saw last summer, he was like, there were days he was in his fleece in his air conditioned room saying, y'all need to turn off your air conditioners. Well, you're in a fleece in your air conditioned room.
Charge your electric vehicles today because the grid is overrun. That happened a couple of times too. And then what the state is doing to independent owner operator truckers is because of AB5 and all of the emissions regulations that they impose on trucking is just, they just want to put everybody out of business apparently here.
But so my closing note is that to the people wondering, well, then where's all this stand with Prop 22? I'll tell you where I stand is that if it gets kept in place for all of the app-based gig workers in California, you guys will be lucky. But it's not, I think a lot of you are like, we want Prop 22 because if you do rideshare, you really don't see the benefits of it, because active hour, you're probably going to earn more than 120% of minimum wage. But where you don't is on the delivery apps that offer you $2-3 an order. You can only do 2 per order. So if you live in San Francisco, where the minimum wage is $19.86, 120% would be like $24. But DoorDash only pays you $4 to do 2 deliveries in an hour, and that's all you can do. DoorDash has to pay $20 per hour to you in that Prop 22 money. But a lot of people see it as, I want that money. To me, it's more about, if you lose Prop 22, you can't even do the work, period.
Right. I mean, people complain about all the little purported perks in Prop 22, but Prop 22 in essence is about being allowed to remain independent contractors.
Exactly.
And so
And
it's
a lot of
carve out.
people miss that though, is what I'm saying.
But it only applies to rideshare and app-based delivery. It doesn't apply to the entire gig economy or the entire app-based gig economy,
Right.
such as, all these TaskRabbit and all these other things that are on app platforms. Prop 22 is just about rideshare and delivery only. And it's no different than the car. It's its own carve out.
But even if you're not under Prop 22, you should even be more worried on the apps then, because you aren't passing the B prong of the ABC test, because you're doing what the company does.
Well, those apps.
So therefore, you might be looked at as you're violating AB5.
You would be, unless you had an exemption, which under the referral agency category of exemptions, dog walkers fall under that. So they would be able to, even though they're app-based, they're not violating the B prong because they have an exemption via the referral agency category exemptions. But what they may violate one of the 11 requirements of the referral agency category of exemptions. So
if you guys like the way this sounds and you want it in your state, please email me so we can talk it through, because clearly you didn't hear how much damage this has done, even to my brain as we talk about it every time. But I do feel like we put it in order today. And
right.
Thank you everybody for joining. Thank you, Karen, as always, for joining, because I think you always put a light on this that people can understand.
You're welcome.
Yeah. And I think it's important that people know, because when we make one of these, it gets back in the algorithm and people see it again. And I just don't want the AB5 people who are still affected to not be heard anymore. I don't want that to dimmer down to a point where you guys aren't even heard. It needs to change. I mean, other states are very, they actually fly out and look at this thing like, hey, look at this work. It doesn't work. Well, but look at this work. And they like it. Like Massachusetts loves it. They think it's a great idea.
Well, the Department of Justice, Biden's Department of Justice, filed an amicus brief on Olson versus State of California in support of AB5. So the Biden administration likes AB5. And the DOL rule, that's a whole nother topic. That rule, the Department of Labor lauded AB5 and the ABC test of AB5 while they were crafting that DOL rule. That's probably, in hibernation right now until the election, and then they'll start going after people.
Right. Well, thank you, everybody. And thank you, Karen. And I see, for some reason, I don't see it here on our counter, but I see that people are watching on multi-platforms. I pulled it up on Twitter. There are people watching on Twitter, and I didn't even see. But if you guys comment, we're supposed to see it here in the StreamYard chat too. So I don't know. I just pulled it up now. But everybody, please take this into account, as a lot of states are pulling crazy maneuvers right now. Minnesota just did something. Massachusetts got a bunch of proposals about gig work. So don't think you're safe anywhere. For some reason, things aren't making a lot of sense right now. And not just in California, but in other states too. I feel like they're getting passed. Like, you can look at things and go, that's stupid, and it'll be passed the next day. So there's just a lot of people out there who feel like these are good ideas. And I think even most of the people who work W-2s would agree with us. Well, no, this country's about being able to do this. It's why we live.
The best way to keep track of what could be coming down the pike in your state is to either follow my group or come join my group, Freelancers Against AB5, or Fight for Freelancers USA, which is also on Facebook. They keep up with all the latest and greatest from all that's going on nationally and in the other states, all these task forces and, crazy laws, being proposed. So there's a way to keep up with it, but keeping up with it in the media is sort of a losing proposition, because it's so confusing that the media people don't even have their facts straight.
I know. A lot. I mean, it's not just people. It's also like news report. I talk to news people sometimes who are like, they don't know what's going on.
Nope, they don't.
I mean, like, they're so lost. They're like, I don't get, I thought they'll say the same thing. I thought Prop 22 solved AB5. And I'm just like, oh.
That's the bane of my existence. I face that every day.
So no, guys, they are not. Prop 22 was a solution for app-based gig workers in California to a much bigger problem called AB5. That's how it is.
That's right.
So with that said, you guys have a great day. Be good to each other. Be safe and earn smart. Be safe out there.
Thanks.
She was just a baby.